Most people believe that when a police officer starts asking questions, your safest move is to answer them. That belief is so common, so deeply baked into the culture, that people rarely even stop to question it. They assume cooperation equals safety. They assume silence equals guilt. They assume that if they just explain themselves clearly enough, calmly enough, politely enough, everything will resolve itself in a few minutes and everyone will go home. But after watching hundreds of body camera videos and sitting through more suppression hearings than I can count, I can tell you something that makes people uncomfortable. Talking is often the moment things begin to go wrong. Not because you are guilty, not because the officer is necessarily malicious, but because the moment you begin answering questions in a roadside encounter, the dynamic shifts in a very specific way. A way most people never notice until it is far too late. There is a quiet assumption built into nearly every police encounter. The officer asks, and you answer. And once that rhythm starts, it's hard to stop. But there is one question, a single, calm, controlled sentence that shifts that rhythm. One question that changes the psychological balance of the encounter. One question that forces the officer to clarify the legal basis for what is happening. The question is simple. Am I being detained or am I free to leave? That sentence sounds almost harmless. It sounds polite, neutral, even a little boring. But in the legal world, it carries enormous weight. And once you understand why, you'll start to see police encounters in a completely different way. Because the truth is, most roadside interactions exist in a strange gray zone that people don't understand. It's not quite voluntary, but it's not quite a formal detention either. It's an ambiguous space where people feel like they must cooperate even when the law doesn't technically require it. And that gray zone is where most problems begin. Picture a very ordinary situation. It's late evening. You're driving home. Maybe you're a little tired. Maybe the road is empty and you didn't notice your speed creeping up. Suddenly, red and blue lights appear in your mirror. Your stomach tightens immediately. You pull over. The officer approaches the window. Every nerve in your body is alert now. Adrenaline is pumping. Your brain is moving fast, but not always clearly. That's normal. Your body treats this like a threat scenario. The officer asks a simple question. Do you know why I stopped you? Most people answer instantly. And that's where the subtle trap begins. Because that question is not really about information. The officer already has a reason for the stop, or at least an explanation they intend to use. The question is about admissions. It's about getting you to say something that can later be interpreted in a way that strengthens their position. If you say, maybe I was speeding, you just made an admission. If you say, I didn't see the sign, you just acknowledge the sign exists. If you say, I'm sorry, that apology can be framed as responsibility. None of this feels like a confession in the moment. It feels like normal conversation. But in courtrooms, normal conversation often becomes evidence. Now here's where the encounter gets more complicated. The law recognizes two fundamentally different types of police interactions. One is a voluntary encounter. In that situation, you are free to leave. You are not legally required to stay. You are not obligated to answer questions. The other is a detention. A detention requires what lawyers call reasonable suspicion, specific, articulable facts suggesting you may be involved in a crime. And here is the crucial part most people never realize. Officers do not always announce which one it is. They might ask questions in a conversational tone. They might stand in a way that blocks your path. They might keep your ID while continuing to talk. Psychologically, it feels like you must stay. Legally, the situation may still be voluntary. And that ambiguity works in the officer's favor. Because as long as you keep talking, the officer keeps gathering information. This is where the question changes everything. Am I being detained or am I free to leave? That sentence forces clarity. If the officer says you are free to leave, the encounter ends. If the officer says you are detained, they are now formally acknowledging that they believe they have legal grounds to hold you. And that matters. Because once a detention is established, everything that happens next can be examined in court. What facts justified the stop? How long did the detention last? Did the officer expand the scope of the stop beyond its original purpose? These questions become legally significant. But before we go further, let me be honest about something that many people misunderstand. Asserting your rights does not guarantee a pleasant experience. In fact, sometimes it does the opposite, and that's the hard truth. Officers are human beings. They operate under stress, under time pressure, often in unpredictable environments. When someone challenges the normal flow of an encounter, it can trigger suspicion or irritation. Not always, but sometimes. You might notice the officer's tone change slightly. You might notice more questions. You might notice the encounter takes longer than it otherwise would have. That's the reality. Rights protect you legally, but they do not always make the moment more comfortable. And yet, from a legal perspective, clarity is almost always safer than ambiguity, because ambiguity is where officers can stretch the boundaries of a stop. Here's where this gets complicated. Even if an officer says you are free to leave, the way you handle that moment matters. If you ask the question in an aggressive tone, the situation can escalate unnecessarily. If you ask it calmly, with steady eye contact and relaxed posture, it communicates something very different. Confidence without hostility. You're not challenging authority. You're clarifying the situation. Body language matters more than people realize. When adrenaline is high, your movements can become abrupt. Your voice can rise without you noticing. Your hands might move quickly. Officers are trained to read those signals as potential threats. So if you ever use that question, the delivery should be slow, calm, and deliberate. Hands visible. Movements minimal. Voice steady. Officer, am I being detained or am I free to leave? Nothing more. Now this is the part most people misunderstand. Asking that question does not magically end a lawful stop. If you were pulled over for speeding, the officer still has the authority to complete that traffic stop. They can check your license, registration, and insurance. They can run your information. The question doesn't erase that authority. What it does is prevent the encounter from quietly expanding beyond its legal boundaries. Let me give you a real example. Several years ago, I reviewed a body camera case involving a traffic stop that lasted nearly 40 minutes. The driver was originally stopped for a minor lane violation. Within minutes, the officer began asking questions about travel plans, employment, where the driver was coming from, where he was going, why he chose that route. The driver answered every question politely. The conversation kept expanding. Eventually, a K9 unit was called. The dog alerted. A search followed. Drugs were found. But during the suppression hearing, the timeline became critical. Because the original reason for the stop, the lane violation, had already been resolved before the dog arrived. The officer had finished writing the warning. So why was the driver still there? Because the driver kept answering questions. The judge ultimately ruled the detention had been extended without reasonable suspicion. The evidence was suppressed, but the driver had already spent months dealing with the consequences of that arrest before the case was resolved. If, at the moment the warning was issued, the driver had calmly asked the question, "Am I being detained or am I free to leave?" the legal timeline might have unfolded very differently. Now let me talk about something people rarely consider: the psychology of officers during roadside encounters. Police officers are trained to control scenes. Control keeps situations predictable. Predictability keeps people safe. When someone asks that question, it momentarily shifts control of the narrative. It forces the officer to articulate their legal justification, and that can create pressure, not aggressive pressure, legal pressure. Because once an officer states they are detaining you, they have effectively locked themselves into a legal position that can later be examined by a judge. This is the trap officers try to avoid, not because they are always doing something wrong, but because uncertainty gives them flexibility. Your question removes that flexibility, and that's why it's powerful. But there are exceptions you need to understand. If an officer has probable cause for a crime, the situation changes dramatically. At that point, they may arrest you. If you are already under arrest, asking the question doesn't undo that. And in certain circumstances, sobriety checkpoints, border zones, specific investigative stops, the legal rules can be slightly different. This is why understanding the principle matters more than memorizing a script. The principle is clarity. You are identifying whether the encounter is voluntary or compulsory. Let me be honest with you again. Some officers will try to avoid answering the question directly. They might say something like, "Just hang tight for a minute," or "Why are you in such a hurry?" or "If you didn't do anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about." These responses are designed to keep the encounter in that gray zone. If that happens, you simply repeat the question, calmly. Officer, I'm just trying to understand. Am I being detained or am I free to leave? No sarcasm, no anger, no sudden movements, just the same steady sentence. And if the officer ignores it completely, then you do not escalate. You do not argue. You do not attempt to physically leave if the officer is clearly preventing you. Instead, you become quiet, because once you have asked the question and it goes unanswered, the legal record of that ambiguity may later become extremely important. Body camera footage captures everything: the tone, the timing, the responses. Judges notice when someone calmly seeks clarification and receives none. Now there's another layer people rarely think about: your own brain. When people are pulled over, adrenaline spikes immediately. Heart rate rises, fine motor control decreases, memory becomes unreliable. This is why people say things they didn't intend to say. This is why they volunteer information they later regret. Your brain is trying to reduce tension as quickly as possible. Talking feels like a way to do that. But legally, talking is often the most dangerous instinct in that moment. The single question we've been discussing acts as a mental anchor, a script you can rely on when your brain is under stress. Am I being detained or am I free to leave? Once that sentence is spoken, the dynamic changes. The encounter becomes defined. Defined encounters are easier to evaluate legally. Undefined ones are not. And this brings me to something I tell clients all the time. Rights are not tools you learn in the moment. They are habits you rehearse beforehand. If you try to remember the right words while an officer is standing at your window, lights flashing behind you, heart pounding in your chest, your brain will not cooperate. Stress erases preparation that hasn't been practiced, but a single sentence repeated enough times becomes automatic, like muscle memory. That's why I tell people to actually rehearse it, out loud, in the car, while driving. Am I being detained, or am I free to leave? Because in the moment it matters, you won't be inventing the sentence. You'll simply be recalling it. And that difference between improvising and remembering can change the entire course of an encounter. Not because the phrase is magic, not because it guarantees the officer will walk away, but because it forces clarity in a system that often runs on ambiguity. And clarity is where the law actually begins to operate.